Good evening, everybody, and welcome to the Covington City Council study session for Tuesday, March 26th. In compliance with state law, City Council special and regular meetings will be held in a hybrid format with in-person, telephonic, and virtual options for public viewing and participation. With that, this meeting is called to order. And Chris, if you'd like to call the roll, please.
Councilmember Soltis.
I am here.
Councilmember Porter.
Here.
Councilmember Hartsock.
Here.
Councilmember Hartshausen.
Present.
Councilmember Simomo.
I'm here.
Mayor Pro Tem Smith.
Here.
Mayor Wagner.
Present.
Thank you.
So we're not.
All right, thank you, Krista. We have one item. We are discussing code compliance for another follow-up from previously, and I will turn this over to Selena.
Good evening, Council and Mayor. So we're here tonight for our follow-up study session on code compliance. And we've got a slide deck to share with you. I'm just bringing this up here. The purpose of tonight's meeting is really a follow-up to the meeting that we had last winter. I think it was in November that we met, where we just really kind of blasted you with the code compliance process. And we wanted to come back. We're going to do a quick overview of what we provided you at that time, and then we want to leave some space for more dialogue. In that last meeting, it was a lot of information giving, and I think we're at a point where we would like to get some feedback and some information back to staff on things you'd like to see with the code compliance program. So I'm just going to jump in tonight, and then my hope is that this is a kind of a facilitated dialogue with the council and staff, questions, some ideas on how to move forward. And we've got some topics that we'll want to touch on, but this is obviously open to all things code compliance. Okay, so let's get this started. And tonight, as you know, we've got Brian, who's our code compliance manager, and then the chief and Regan. And I don't know if Mark is on. He might not be, but Mark, our attorney, obviously plays a very big role in the work that we do here. So these are just the topics we're going to go over tonight. I'm going to really go through these hopefully pretty fast for me. And if we need to pause or stop, please do so. Please stop me along the way. I really want to get to that last bullet, that repeat offender bullet. That's where our conversation really left off in November. So this slide here is a slide that you saw in the last presentation. This really just talks about our priority levels. So when we look at how we triage complaints that come in, we really try to use these as our boundaries. So we have our low priority cases, which are concerns that are more aesthetic or nuance related. They're not fire life safety, right? They're not posing a great risk. With this enforcement approach, we tend to focus on education, awareness. We really push for voluntary compliance. So that's Brian going out to the folks that have the complaint and really try to work with them to get to those corrective actions. Our moderate priority list, those are those lesser level impact safety concerns. Those may involve issues such as property maintenance or code violations. So we're really getting into our zoning code there. And sometimes these may be stop work orders or red tags in certain areas. And we see that more in our building permit arena. This enforcement approach for these are, we're gonna work with them, but we may gradually escalate those enforcement actions, particularly if it's been a red tag, it's a building permit or something along those lines that we want to get them to compliance pretty quickly. We could do fines, but those are generally a lower level. We don't really want to use those here if we can get folks to collaborate with us to address the violation. And then these higher priorities, these are ones that are significantly impactful on fire life safety and public health. So these are things that are going to pose a substantial risk to the community's well-being. I would kind of argue too that under this is where you're getting into not just the building piece of it, but maybe there's critical areas that are being affected or major stormwater systems that we want to make sure that we're complying with. Tree removal also tends to fall under this if it was done illegally. So our approach for staff here is that it becomes a high priority, immediate action. We're using our stop work orders. We're really getting out there, making sure that the owner, the person understands the measurements And that's really where we're gonna get quicker into those fines. We're gonna wanna get to that voluntary compliance very, very quickly because of the fire life safety. And these really may involve coordination with our police department and our fire department as well. So when we look at how we prioritize or when these come in, there's a list there that we look at. And we really just look at the nature and the severity of the violation and just determine the priority level, the balance for the need to enforce, and then the goal of getting people to compliance, right? That's our goal, is compliance. And a lot of this also can, as we when we get in the next slide, there's this continuous loop of kind of evaluating these and having those conversations and making sure that we're driving towards that. And really also, I think Brian tries to address some of the root cause as well, right? What was the purpose? Like, how did this violation come? A lot of the times that's because folks don't understand or they're unaware. So how can we educate them, but then get them to that compliance? And this is just a quick snapshot of some of the things I just verbally outlined when we talk about low priority, moderate, and high priority. So those things, again, those low priorities, those things could be like your operational vehicles, your junk vehicles, garbage, debris. And we also have an intersection with the clean team as well when it comes to our downtown. So some of these do kind of rise to a higher priority, not in the sense of a priority, but because we have Jennifer that can go out there and maybe do a little bit quicker than maybe the property owner would. So then we have our moderate priorities. Those are listed here, kind of those minor tree, minor vegetation, animals. And then really those high priority are those fire life safety. And these are really based on what we see a lot. Like these lists here, this is kind of what we experience. Yes, Joe.
I'm sure we asked this in the winter, but what's the breakdown between percentage wise of low, moderate and high that we get?
I don't have an exact number, but
I'll take a guesstimate.
it's probably 95% low.
Okay.
It's very, very rare that we actually get into high priority. And again, that's like somebody's out there clearing their wetland or doing work in a stream or building onto their house, basically a habitable structure where they're going to be living. You get more into your low or moderate if they're building a detached garage or someplace where they may be out working, but it's not a habitable structure. But again, it's pretty low that you get into the high priorities.
Okay.
Yeah. And we do have some slides that show kind of just where we are today on some of these topics as well. So.
Okay, just
Oh,
a
go ahead.
comment on thank you for that breakdown. I appreciate it. The majority of the code violations I hear about are what we designate as low priority. So there's a disconnect there
Yeah,
between us and the
it's-
public. And
so-
so what I would say is, one of the things I would do, we need to change that language from low priority to maybe priority 3 or 2 or 1.
Like a tier or something
Yeah,
like that.
low priority immediately says to them, you don't care. And
Does this
That is-
go to the public?
This
Yeah,
doesn't go,
yeah.
this is.
Yeah.
It's already heard all
How
policy.
we
Yeah.
do it.
yeah,
I
I would be careful with that.
But words matter. I think that's
Yeah.
something we can.
And it
Yeah.
would be very easy for us to inadvertently communicate in a way that.
Yeah.
Well, that's a low priority.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Priorities, I don't know.
Yeah.
I just tell them what Joe says it's low priority.
Yeah, so,
Joe Samo.
so
My name.
I know we're gonna talk about it, but I think one of the things I think we need to have more of a conversation about is those like low priority may be low priority for us, but they're not low priority for the public. And we can't be looking at those. If it's 95% of the comments, we can't say all those are low priority anymore. We gotta move them to, especially the cars, I think. You gotta move that up to medium. So,
And we understand
Yeah.
that. So we understand that anytime anybody files a complaint, no matter where it goes on there, it's a high priority. for them.
Yeah.
So we really
Yeah.
do understand that when a citizen comes to us with some kind of concern, that it means something to them. So.
And I would maybe add to that, just like a perspective, is that, if 95% of the things that Brian is getting are low priority, that doesn't mean Brian's not out there doing the
Right.
work, right? Brian now has to triage within that bucket, right? So you might have all of these now, let's say all of these issues came in, these whatever, 7 or 8 that I have up here. Well, now Brian applies that same model of risk, moderate risk, low risk to the low bucket, right? So I think I'm kind of tacking on a little bit to that kind of word piece, because I think when we also hear low priority, it's like, well, he's not really getting to them, and then that's not a true statement,
Okay.
right?
And we do have a slide at the end of this kind of showing that everything that we've received this year, and you'll see how even though 95% may have come in at the lower tier, how much have already been addressed.
Right.
So, and again, just because it's high priority doesn't mean that I'm taking a whole week to have to address this. It's just, if there's something that I can do,
Competing.
it just goes to the top and then it just goes down. So
Yeah.
most of what I do is what we call low priority or priority 3
Yeah.
now.
Priority
You
X.
got it listed that way,
Right.
is how it relates to health, like safety.
Yes,
High priority is.
Of course.
it's kind of all
that's
hands
how
on
that
deck.
Low, moderate.
Yeah.
high
That as
came in.
well.
Mhm. Yeah,
I mean, you can just call them priority L, M, and H.
Whatever makes people feel better, but I mean, hospitals categorize things this way as well, and I don't know that that means that they should change anything.
Right.
I had one question,
Yeah.
and I was here for the November discussion, and maybe this was, but you snuck in a comment about Jennifer, being there and able to get to a property before the property manager.
no, that's not what I
Property
meant.
manager, so
Yeah.
she doesn't go
Yeah.
onto private properties to do any of her work, but she does sometimes work with like a property manager.
Just.
Or sometimes the code violation is regarding like signs or something
Sure.
that's in the right of way,
Now,
which has historically been code
The
compliance,
relationship.
but now we have that relationship where
Huh.
I actually go out with her maybe once every couple of weeks. We pick signs and every place where we pick illegal signs in public right of way, we also clean up.
Yeah.
So we're combining our efforts, is I think what Selena was trying to say,
Yeah.
but no, she doesn't go on
Yeah, 'cause
private
not-
properties to do any of that. That's their responsibility. So
Yeah.
good catch.
I am glad that she is now wearing, the vest. I think.
Yeah.
That's for sure.
No, it was
Visible.
funny, because I got a picture of somebody stealing somebody's signs, right? And it had a picture of her with the signs. opposite of us, And I was like, no, she works for the city. It was kind of funny.
Yeah.
It was, yeah.
You have a question about it?
Well, I was just going to say that I mean, from a triage and a how do you manage the workload perspective, this all makes sense, but I would also argue on behalf of residents, the noise complaints, it can be a serious, like, it can cause people to go berserk when somebody's playing their drum set and 4 or 5 neighbors hear it and they don't either stop doing it, which isn't necessarily code because you can call it off, right? But I think when we think about health and safety, right? It's different when you're living next to something. I mean, because it may not be putrid garbage debris now, but it probably will by the time y'all get to it. So like, how do we nip it in the bud so that it's not?
Well,
And I
and
don't
I'll
think we
say,
categorize that.
Brian gets on this stuff as soon as he
Yeah,
possibly.
and that's why
Saying-
the
But-
end, the end
We do
slide.
have to have, we do have to have a method
Right.
to determine which ones to respond to first, and that's all this is.
Yeah.
Right,
Show us
this,
the end slide.
yeah.
Oh.
Yeah. No, we buried the headline.
And it's gonna be not exciting at the end too.
No, it will take.
Yeah.
Me, I'd say, add another person.
Well,
Yeah.
Yes and no, but when we look at that range of how, it's a balance of how many things are coming in, how many things do we have to respond to, what feels immediate to somebody? A second person doesn't necessarily address that need, right? I think the police officers could probably speak to that in better form than we could. Sometimes it is a lot of education, like you might not like that your neighbor's playing drums right now, but they're technically within the noise ordinance and they can play those drums right now, right? That's an education piece, right? I think when we talk about garbage and debris, we've got these requirements for garbage pickup, right? Do we need to maybe go upstream of that and think about differently how we've instituted that within the city, right? Because that's optional, right? So there's some of these that it might feel like a quicker response is the way to go. And that might be true in some of these, but I think there's a balance there as well as with some of that education and outreach and just folks understanding, right? Like what is really truly a nuisance and what is it that you just don't like? Yeah. So moving on to the complaint types and investigations, and we kind of talked a little bit about this, with this kind of complaint based. So these come in through Covington Connects, which is our See-Click Fix. We identify that, Brian works on those. The other way that these can come in are these fire life safety, the see something, say something. Which, we work really close with our partners in all the other departments as well as our police officers. And Brian also drives around the city. I think today I saw him just kind of randomly stop because there's some folks that were out in the roadway that didn't have traffic control, right? That's not something that came in a See-Click Fix. That's just being present in the city, right? And our maintenance team does a lot of that work as well. And then there's these kind of like non-complaint based, signs are really the best example of that. That's the one Brian just described where we're not getting complaints on that, but we're taking that upon ourselves to be proactive, right? It's kind of the easiest one to be proactive about. And then here is just kind of a rough outline of, that process of how that works. Which again, really getting to that voluntary compliance is our goal. Any questions on this before? And then this is the slide. This is, you all saw this last time. I reprinted it out. This is really just kind of the larger, broader, more detailed process map for, how we kind of work through this process. And, going back to what we talked about before, you can, and we work really hard to try to get out of that loop, but you can get into this kind of voluntary compliance loop, right? Where Brian's doing first initial contact, people are kind of maybe slow to respond, or they respond, but maybe they financially can't do the work that we're asking them to do, or they don't have resources to do that. So then Brian's now trying to connect them. Hey, can I check in with you in a couple of weeks? Will you then be able, we're really trying to facilitate that compliance. And when we feel or get that feedback, I think that's kind of that loop where we're really trying to do compliance. But it feels like it's taking long, but now we're working with actual humans and then their case by case scenario that they're in, right? Some people come in, they take care of it. They're like, I didn't know. And we just had one recently where it was an elderly woman and she just didn't have the means to pay for the permits that she needed. And Brian just kept working with her. And then we were able to close that out years later, right? But she got the permit, she complied, and she moved forward, but she was in a financial hardship, right? So, there's really extreme cases, but I think most of them, I would think Brian would agree that most people really they don't want to be in trouble, right? They want to move towards compliance.
And even some of the low priority stuff that, is of concern, it's still not easy for them to do it. So that's why when Selena just used the 3 week is even if it's garbage or a nuisance vehicle or something, it's not like they can in the next day take care of it a lot of times. And that's where kind of going back to you say another person. Well, a lot of these are, I reach out and then I reach out 2 weeks later because we have to be able to give them time. And if I reach out to somebody every 2 days, then all of a sudden the relationship goes south. And that's the last thing that I want. It's the best is for me to have a good relationship with whoever I'm working with. And the more, especially when I know that it's not possible for them to necessarily accomplish what they need to do. So a lot of these are where, okay, I'm going to reach out to you in 3 weeks. And then basically I know, and I can use our software to say, okay, this is my next time I need to reach out or my next time it's an inspection. So even though we have so many cases, it doesn't necessarily mean more people are going to get these cases resolved in a quicker amount. And so I know that you guys were both kind of touching on that.
And then, we do realize that there is a point where, and that's that measurement of that social aspect of it, where Brian's like, yeah, they're just not going to comply, right? Or like, we're not getting movement, they're not responding. Well, then we can take that next step, which is the notice of violation, notice of order, right? So now we're actually kind of serving them like, hey, we mean business and we need you to comply. And we don't really take those lightly. Brian's very thoughtful. He involves me, he involves Regan, he involves Mark, and we like, okay, it's time, right? Because at that point you start accruing fines, this person's, it becomes a more aggressive, I don't want to say aggressive, but a more intense process. at that
It
point.
takes a lot of staff time. It
Mhm.
makes the relationship go south, because anytime a fine's involved, then we really are the bad, there's not very much where I can always go into someplace and say, I'm here to help. Because that's, while I am, they don't see it that way. Once those fines start accruing, then not only me, but the whole entire city becomes the bad guy, and we really don't want that. And I think part of what we were also hoping to get out of this is, historically, we haven't done those type of fines for the lower priority type of issues. But those are also those issues that you guys are probably hearing from the citizens, and not necessarily the ones that we actually do the high priority, because a lot of times those are in somebody's backyard or something else where they're not really open to the public or people can see. But we just haven't really got to that point of going to the level of fines. We really just want to get voluntary compliance. But that's part of, I think, some of the feedback we would like to get back from the city council is, do you want to see a change in something like that?
So when a situation becomes chronic, and I'll use the parked cars in the yard as an example. So if these are chronic abusers of the code, does that kind of change the tempo?
It could.
It can.
Mhm.
I will say that when we talk about chronic, there's not a lot of chronic properties out there. There are some. There's one that's really been where we've worked, and Regan has provided you a lot of feedback or updates in the last year, where somebody did have 13 cars, and then we got them down to 8 or less. And then over the next couple of years, it kind of went back up to 13, and now it's
In a few weeks.
Yeah.
You guys get them down.
so, but that's not common. Usually when
Yeah,
somebody comes in and
constantly
cleans up
count
their
those cars
property,
right away.
they don't necessarily, it doesn't revert back. A lot of those situations are squatter homes. Really homes more that the police department deal with, and we're dealing with a couple of those now, that even with chronic nuisance ordinances or anything, these people are squatters. They're not paying their fines. They're not, even if we go in and fine or we do something like that, it's likely not gonna help the situation. The only way is us to really have to go in, and if there's a property management group, try to work with them, but some of these are actually the homeowners are the problem.
Yeah,
And-
because they need to go through a court process that they're not willing to do. And so we beg them, and it's not, fines is not gonna change it, that they just don't want to do the process. Because the process is also expensive, so if we
Right.
fine them, we actually limit their ability to go
Give
through
me
the
an
eviction
example of why
process.
someone would not want squatters out of their home.
Because it's expensive.
I'm
No,
no,
it's a
no,
great
it's
question.
No,
great
it is a great
question.
question, but it costs a lot of money to do. I mean, it costs thousands of dollars to fund an eviction, because you gotta get a lawyer. And then now King County is providing lawyers to people who are squatting, who are then delaying everything. So it's costing even more and more and more. So you're
Because
looking at,
property must already be paid
well,
for,
it
at
depends.
least mortgage wise.
It just depends. Like,
Yeah.
we don't necessarily have that information.
Yeah.
So one of them is a corporation who
Yep.
bought a couple properties within the city. They're out of, I think, Wisconsin. So there's not, I talked to these people and they're not even anywhere around here. So the property, for whatever reason, went vacant, whether they bought it for speculation or whatever. They put renters in, the renters either quit paying or left, and then squatters just moved in. And now these corporations refuse to even send their employees to these properties because it's too dangerous. Like, I won't usually go to these properties anymore unless I have the
Yeah.
police,
Yeah.
because it is, and that wasn't like that when I started this. I would go up and knock on doors and talk to whoever was there, and the world's changed. But that's one of the reasons, is that they send it to their legal starts going through these Washington laws, which are very, 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 very much
Protective.
protective
Squatters.
of
Protective,
squatters, of tenants,
Yeah.
but some of the tenants are squatters. And so they may send it to their legal has to find the time to start going through this process. Again, King County there's a lot of nonprofits out there who basically will provide these legal services. And we just had one that is right by the car place, the next door neighbor. That took like a year for that property owner to have the squatter who was living in an RV removed. It took that long. And I was continually, contacting them. I was going through the court cases that were in King County Court, so I could say, okay, yeah, they're really moving forward with this. And then all of a sudden, something would go in and the attorney for the squatter would basically get it pushed back 2-3 months before they could even get back to court. And there's simply nothing that a property owner can do. They cannot go in, they cannot evict them, they cannot remove, they can't remove garbage.
This is like Pacific Heights. Do you remember that?
Yes,
And-
it's,
and then-
they're beholden.
And then
Yeah,
one thing, even after that happens, and after a year, and we're still seeing this on that property, Washington State, I think, has probably the second most strict rule on, you can't even get rid of anything that's on the property after the squatter's been legally evicted
For like 90, is it
for
90
45 days. There's one
You have
state,
to-
I don't remember which one.
California. Was it
No, I
California?
think it was,
Oh.
it was like Indiana or
Oh, was it
Illinois or something,
Indiana?
was like
Okay.
90 days, but it can be absolute garbage and they cannot remove that because it's potentially something that was.
Or they have to pay to store.
But that's the same
Or
thing
they
actually.
store it, so
Yeah,
they,
when
they
it
could
costs
store.
thousands of dollars to get it
So-
to storage and.
Right, and that's the same thing that applies to encampments as well. So when WashDOT goes in and cleans up an encampment, all of that stuff that they take generally has to be held for those 45 days. Like that, this is at like, yeah, it's, so while you think it's like, oh, that's a lot of trash or otherwise, it's
Yeah,
considered
it's
valuable to
biohazard is
that
what it
person,
is.
so therefore it's held. Yeah, sorry,
Yeah.
Beth, you've been
No,
patient.
Well, so that particular one, and as I was reading about something we were looking at for the consent in the last week, or at our last meeting, the nuisance part pulled up, and then I was researching it a little bit more when I had time, and it was talking about empty houses, empty vacant buildings, whether it's a resident or a business. And I know this was a really big deal, especially in 2020, like when I first came on the council, and there were all these work sessions about blight homes or, just something that is going to become a problem if it doesn't get moved in the bud. Now, this particular property owner, as I understand it, allowed that person on there because they wanted somebody to be on their property. Well, that's a whole nother scenario between that and it's, to me, it just seems like there's got to be, we have laws on the books. Again, Washington State sounds like they kind of usurp some of those things, but the reason that we put that on there is because we know if a property is left vacant, something will probably go sideways if it's not maintained. And I think the most frustrating part for me and probably for other residents is that that's not even anyone invested in our community. They really don't care.
Yeah.
They bought it to make money and they're out of town. And that is a real shame that we don't have something that we can do to, they're only in it for the money, so what can we do? A lien on their property. I mentioned this before. I know it's horrible, but they don't really care. Honestly, they don't. And if they cared, they would have tried to take care of it in the beginning to prevent all of this. for them. That's my personal opinion.
Yeah.
But I also know that that is what keeps coming up amongst residents as well.
Sure.
It's frustrating that you guys are having to go through all of this, waste our resources,
And it's still.
and it's still a problem.
Because it's a problem at a higher level than us.
Right.
It's
Yeah,
not-
and
it's
the
not that-
frustrating part is if we did place a lien, the community's still gonna think we're not doing anything.
Well, but at least we
Right.
have, at least we can say that,
Yeah, we can say that we do a lot, but
It's
they don't
something.
care unless something changes, right?
That they see that.
yes,
Right,
if that's the
right. I
only.
don't care that all those cars have lien
So
on the
it
property.
needs
Right.
to change at the top,
Right,
at the county and the state level.
correct.
To be able to get that fixed.
But at least we can say that we're recouping money for all the work that we're trying to do because we're being
Yeah,
confined
Yeah,
by laws that are higher up.
Yeah.
And like to your point, like what can we do to
Push it.
push it higher up the flagpole? So that
What
it-
about city ordinances, like some cities, I've heard like Palm Springs, for example. They have some ordinances about, control of the residential that lives down there to keep short-term rentals from being a thing. I mean, what kind of things like that are at our disposal to maybe help us mitigate? If we know.
In
I mean,
some of these, I don't
I
know
know
that.
it causes a pain in
Yeah.
some respects, but they're put into place for bigger reasons.
There are, certain cities that do like where you have a rental that you have there's a program
So
in the
you're
city
registering
to
it
register it so that
yeah.
we would know. Like right now for us, we don't know if a property's vacant. We don't know if a property is a rental. That's not something that we do. And I'm not saying that we change anything to make that, 'cause it's a pretty big thing probably to go there. But in most of these cases that we're seeing, I don't know that it actually is going to affect anything because it's still generally squatters who weren't legal renters there in the first place. It's somebody who just they know when something, even if it's a couple of days, is vacant. And they just move in, and once they are in, it takes that much time to move them out. And there's nothing we can do about that. If we could maybe start again doing fines against the property owner, against the renters. The renters probably aren't gonna pay them, figuring they're not paying their rent. And the property owner, it's a huge cost. So that's the biggest thing that I get back, especially the one that we're talking about, is he expended a lot of money. And this guy wasn't a corporation, but he was somebody who purchased this land and probably wants to do something with it. It cost him a lot of money for his legal fees to have these people who were squatters in the first place evicted off his property after a year. And so for us to then go in and say, okay, well, now your fines are $10,000 above all of your legal fees for you really being the victim of somebody going on your property and laws that mainly the state of Washington have enacted, gets potentially a little harder. Yeah.
Contingency? Like, if you're not doing anything.
Wait, I didn't think he was doing anything. like-
Certainly, and that's why, with this, I'll go in and I'll work with them to ensure that they are doing something, and then they give me the court case in Superior Court, and then I have that, so I can keep track of everything that's going on. That's how I knew with this one that, okay, they would be in, and then the court would basically have on the King County court system
Yeah.
that they were in, and now it's 3 months before they go back to see the judge because of whatever reason that happened. So
Yeah.
certainly if we have a case where they're really not doing anything and we know, then we really could probably go and say, okay, well, now we are going to start doing the fines so that
If we did fines, how many would that percentage wise knock off the list? Maybe, if the fines worked. Using your best judgment, knowing some of these are corporations.
there's
knowing-
only one left.
Okay.
And this is one where they actually had 2 properties in the city, and one of them they've already dealt with. So I don't doubt that they're not doing it, but again, it takes some time.
Yeah,
And so-
the time and the threshold are beyond what we can do at a city level, right? Like we're really beholden at some point to the state process, the county process. And I think, the mayor hit that, that if you want to go upstream of that, then those laws need to change.
And there's evictions taking like 2 and 3 years.
Yeah.
So, and that's, just it gets held up in court for that long.
Yeah, and I can see
or
them being a
whatever
scenario
the
where they're like,
process.
oh, shoot, this is happening in my property 3 months in, and they start it, well, yeah, then at that point, they are caught up in the business, and it's gonna just take how long it takes.
Yeah. And go ahead.
Oh, that's it. And luckily, it's not so bad right now because house values are so much. And we don't have a lot of houses going into foreclosure. In 2009, 2010, 2011, this was a real problem. And if that happens again with all the new laws the state has enacted, and it's gonna be way worse than it ever was 10 years ago when we were doing this. With once these homes, next recession or
Yeah.
whatever, when people start walking away from their homes, it's gonna be a problem. And again, at our level.
Like the house away across the street from the skate park where they had the lawn chairs on
Yep.
the roof.
Yep, and I told that story that one made it on the front page of the New York, or the Seattle Times, and then we were actually getting calls from like CBS and stuff, New York,
Really?
having this conversation, and this was 2011, 2012. I was where we were the front page of the Seattle Times, and Whitney Houston's death was on the 4th page, so. So it happens.
Yeah.
And I actually told the story to somebody yesterday, is like something that started off really, really, what seemed to be a simple thing, all of a sudden is on the front page of a
Yeah.
paper, and
Right.
national media are calling and running stories, and so
Yeah.
we always gotta be careful, which is getting a little bit
Right.
away from what we're talking about, but,
Well, I do want to make sure that we can walk away from today knowing what council's intentions are with regard to repeat offenders.
Yep.
That's one of
That's
the things.
here.
Yeah, and so I think do you have another slide? So you want
Yeah,
to finish
just
that?
one
and then
real
we can-
quick, and then we can get into maybe what this will temper what we want to talk about. So then these are just I wanted just to put up here, these are our code compliance processes. So we have this notice of order, we can do civil infractions, which are tickets, we don't do those. And I would argue, I think Brian would argue, is that the one where we'd have to do some updates.
we would have to do
Yeah.
some updates. There may be some instances where they're valid. Basically, they're like a parking ticket. So the police do those things quite often
Yeah.
when we get to a point of we need to find somebody, civil infractions generally aren't the right course. It's the notice of violation, which then just ends up giving daily fines, and we'd only have to do it once, and they
Yeah,
just get fined every
right.
day.
And then you've got your abatement process, that's a court order, that's a warrant, that's, at that point, we're really working closely with our legal team and our police officers, and then you've got the liens. And while, I'll just say this, while liens seem good, the reality of recouping our full cost against those liens is pretty limited, right? So you could put that lien on there, but the legal and financing resources to get to file, collect, diminishes that cost a little bit, but there's still an option. So just wanted to put those are kind of what what's not on here is what we've been saying, which is that voluntary compliance, right? But these are kind of the more action oriented. So one of the questions that came up, and I've got 2 slides here, and then we can talk a little bit about it, was this kind of the issue statement was what I took away, and we can also get that more clear, is how should the city respond to repeat violations and chronic nuisances differently? So some of the outcomes we brainstormed, and I'm not going to go into a lot of depth here, you can read the slide, but if we wanted to pursue maybe highlighting this process, we can do it now, but it's not really defined in our code. It would be us, doing a policy change within our code, and then of course, a process change with us looking at priorities and tracking that information. So, one of the first things anytime you want to do that, you want to just establish clear definition and criteria for what constitutes a repeated or a chronic nuisance. Some of the research that we did, that could be a property with a certain number of nuisance activities. So you've got 5 or 6 violations, right? And then you can also have a scenario or where the property owner repeats that same violation over and over again within a certain time period. So we go out there, we get compliance, 6 months later, we're out there again for the same issue, getting towards compliance, and we're kind of in that loop with them. So, those are just some things we saw when we researched this. Determine the number of touch points or response time before moving directly to a notice of order. So as we talked about, we're kind of in that, Brian does this very facilitative loop. Is it that, we're going to do 3 or 4 touch points? If there's no response, we're automatically into that notice of violation for, repeated behaviors. So that could be shortening the standard facilitative process, kind of a final warning. And then, but always really striving for kind of an easy out, low cost resolution for those who do the right thing properly, right? So you could send that final warning. Sometimes that gets people to respond, right? And then at that point, you're like, okay, we'll give you, that easy out resolution. But for those that maybe don't take that upon themselves, that final warning seriously, then maybe we move into those next options. Couple other things here, clarifying applicable compliance processes. So, we would want to get really clear on what do we do in residential zones, multifamily, mixed use, commercial, because you get into that area of owner occupied versus tenant versus property management. And I think we navigate that fairly well now, but I think that's just something for us to think about, right? Like dealing with a chronic issue, maybe in our downtown with a property manager. is that different than dealing with a single family homeowner or tenant? I don't know the answer to those are questions we'd want to ask ourselves. And then just always, education and outreach, like these are dynamic problems and what can we do to help our citizens understand kind of just the basic rules and regulations within the city, right? What can we do upstream of that to maybe help deter them to get to a violation? That obviously is a lift and that takes time and energy and resources to do. It's not insurmountable, but you have to be thoughtful about it. So those are some of the kind of brainstorming things we came up with. And then I just wanted to just bring up some considerations of, a change to this or creating this repeated violation or chronic nuisance provision. We'd want to make sure that we have some guardrails for people who might want to like manipulate that, right? Because we do see that now. We're like, I just don't like my neighbor, so I'm going to report on everything, right? And I think I shared with you the one where the gal reported on her neighbor, realized the neighbor had moved, it was a new homeowner, tried to retract her complaint, but at that point we already knew, right? So we see that a lot, that actually happens. So we get pulled into those neighbor disputes. So is there an off ramp now where maybe we go, you guys go deal that with King County dispute resolution, or, like maybe there's an off ramp there. We talked a little bit about those impact and disparities, those cost of compliance, those vulnerable populations and social emotional factors. Right now in this facilitated process, Brian can kind of with, nudge folks and try to get resources. But if they're chronic, right, we might be getting somewhere quicker, which could have implications to, their inability there. Obviously mental health and well-being. We talk a lot about when we see these, what is the root cause of this, right? It could be many things, but I think it's worth thinking about well-being. And then just the community relationships, because once we get more assertive, those calls come to you, right? And so how do we balance that? And, some of the things we thought about, like to mitigate some of these considerations is obviously always being fair, trying to be fair, being accountable, providing access to resources, which we really try to help people do, and then just making sure we're doing community engagement. We can come back to this, but I want to just flash these numbers here really quick. So do you want to talk about this slide, Brian?
Sure. So this slide here, and some of this maybe Regan had provided you before, but we use Covington Connects, which is what we try to funnel all complaints to go through, except for some police when it's the non-emergency line or 911, obviously. But in 2023, we received 1,381 submittals through Covington Connects. And when we have talked to the Covington Connect staff, the C-Click Fix people, it's a lot for a city our size, they say, a very lot. And so those go generally to the police department for parking. As you can see, parking is really about 40% probably of all complaints we get. And probably 80% of those are street parking and 20% may come to us for parking.
How many of those are just people thinking that someone can't park there when they're legally allowed to park there?
A lot of them.
Yeah. And I would say in some manner, some of this is just a neighbor doesn't like somebody parking. It becomes a neighbor dispute through the C-Click Fix app, which not very fun to be involved in the middle of it. Cause it's like, I don't like the car's not facing the right direction. That doesn't get to change how you feel about life. You shouldn't, but you report every single one of them. And when we get there, the car's gone.
Yeah, and even if it's not a valid complaint, it still takes our time.
And maybe what we can do is we can
Yeah.
share.
So-
the
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
and then the next
Just
one
so it
is
is.
basically the 2024, what we had, so the 247 so far. And this is the slide I was talking about, because a lot of what I got back from the first meeting was, it takes so much time. Well, this is the code compliance cases for this year. So far, well, as of the 20th of this month, we've had 28 open code violation cases. Of those, 24 have already been closed. So obviously there's 4 open, and the average time to close the cases that have been closed has been a little over 5 days. So you have outliers, you have the squatters, and you have somebody who's got a lot of nuisance vehicles or something that just simply are not these, but we really jump on these really quickly. And we get out there and we determine if there's a violation. If the violation is, we get a hold of whoever we can. And a majority of them are less than a week. of.
I see Sean riding over there, so I
Yeah.
think we got this coming.
Yeah.
The four that are open, are they still, are they relatively new or they've been open for?
Well, they're new, that's
This
just for
year.
2024.
Yeah, no, I meant like, are they a week old already or are they
I
four
think-
that like you, maybe a month old?
I think a couple of them are probably at like January, but
Okay.
I think a couple of them are probably in March.
Okay,
Yeah.
so they're not too, it's not too bad.
Yeah.
But
And then
we
just,
saw
it's not up there, but I think right now we probably have 37 open code violation cases that date back to like 2003. So, you know, we were twice that amount a year and a half, 2 years ago, coming out of COVID and the staffing issues that we had. Community development lost a lot of staff for a good year, and building it back up. So,
So we've got less than 15 minutes. I think it'd be a good time to go back to this slide now and hear about council's thoughts and desires on repeat offenders and chronic offenders. And if you want anything changed, and if so, how would you like to see that?
Remind me again, if you gave us the stat, how many are repeat, how many properties, I'll just call it property, are repeat offenders? We know the one, but
maybe 10%.
10% of the 1,300 that.
Of the open that you.
Oh,
have.
of the open cases
No,
that we
just
have.
General, just
Yeah,
like, so
about
like, if we
10%.
do anything,
Okay.
how much of an impact would it be?
How often are you, how many of those cases are you going?
Not
back to?
often. I mean, usually when somebody cleans up their property, it stays cleaned up.
Right, okay.
I mean, it's not a huge.
Probably just a handful.
Yeah.
Saying.
But they're
Um,
probably the ones driving everyone.
But,
They are,
but,
yeah.
yeah, they are the
And
ones
they're
that
the
we
ones
receive a lot
that,
of
that make
complaints
the
for.
community feel like we're not doing
Yeah.
it.
Yeah.
Right.
They're the
Right.
ones we all You're probably outliers.
And they're the
right?
ones
Off
that,
the map
you know,
right now.
obviously takes up a lot of my time. But like I say, generally when you have a bunch of nuisance vehicles or something and you finally get them to be able to clean it up, a lot of times they don't want the property to revert back to what it was. They're like, oh, this is so much better. My wife's so much happier. That,
I
you know,
just-
I get a lot of that, but sometimes they're,
Well, the follow-up to it then is, what is their reasoning for, most of it,
Mhm.
I mean, this one fellow is not, it can't be, it's a business, it's not for lack of having funds to do it, although that's sometimes the case. But
Mhm.
usually if it's a repeat offender, it's somebody that really just probably doesn't like the code and is gonna do whatever they want regardless.
Yeah.
And they don't
Yeah.
fit in to the community members that really wanna do the right thing,
so,
right?
yeah.
Am I just kind of feeling out the?
Certainly.
So
And
how does that impact?
When,
you, I
with
guess?
repeat offender, again, as Selena was saying, we don't necessarily need to have any different regulations to skip
Mhm.
those steps.
Yeah.
We can really start going, and we generally do. I know I go back when any case I go, or I get, I go back, I research, okay, well, this person had a property violation 7 years ago, 5 years ago, 8 years ago. So I do when I go back check. To be honest, I've been doing this so long, I know which properties have had it that date back 12 years.
Sean's
Um,
got some questions.
No, I
But-
really, yeah.
You know, it's, we don't necessarily need it. I would actually say it's probably better for almost drug houses that we're dealing with, because I'm trying to get looped into a few of those. And to try and get a chronic nuisance for police activity at these is probably, would be more of a concern or more of a thought for me than actually nuisance vehicles or something along those lines, because these properties, these drug properties that we're dealing with right now, it's hard for me to go in and do something. It's certainly hard for them to clean up the property, and maybe that's probably a bigger need than just for say
Yeah,
vehicles or.
We don't have drug enforcement because King County is not providing it. So we don't have any manner or method to do that except for with what we have. So we can't do traditional drug enforcement, which would be to use informants, go in, do warrants, things like that. We don't have that. So, the other piece of that puzzle then is to use code to work. Because a lot of times there's massive code violations all over the place. So we use code and the police to deal with some of the nuisance houses.
But I do know, and this is probably something that would be more for Mark or our city
Mhm.
attorney, that I do believe there are codes that will say, okay, well, the police have been here
Yep.
10 times in the last 2 months. That is now a chronic nuisance that we abate.
Yeah.
That's not necessarily code enforcement,
Right.
although we're usually involved in something like
Yeah.
that, as chief says, is usually when you have that, there's other code enforcement issues. But that, I see the chronic nuisance more even for the
Yes.
benefit of the police than for
And
for
I would,
code enforcement.
I would say the research in doing this, that was a lot of the trigger for a lot of the cities that added this. And then in fact, in their chronic nuisances, a lot of them say the police chief will do this, right? So, I think, I can kind of feel what Mark would say is, it doesn't hurt to put something in there that's like a little more robust and clear, right? Like we have processes and we can have policy around how we implement those. Like Brian said, we can shorten that, facilitate it and go right to that notice of order if that's the will of how we want to do it. But if we want to put some like real clear lines, then updating the code is the other methodology.
So here's what I'd suggest. I appreciate this and I think that's a really good start. I don't have anything to add, but I think doing those clear definitions and, setting a number of touches and then, when we say final warning, it may not be the final warning, but if you start using language like that, it says, your time is running out, that may push a couple people. So I appreciate that. I would also appreciate, make some suggestions on code that we can strengthen. Yeah, if it would help you, that'd be great. We don't want to do things that make it more difficult for you to do your job, but if there are some fixes we can make, that'd be outstanding. With see-click fix, if a majority of our reports are parking, illegal parking, I don't mean the squad or illegal cars, but illegal parking, let's pull those out. Make so you can't report that. Can you decide what? If
It's interesting you say that. Cities are doing that.
Yeah.
That
if
is
it's
what cities are
400
doing.
Illegal parking, let's pull those out, so you're not getting them on your desk. And then if people start calling the whatever, but if that's 400, let's get rid of those.
So
And
is
just,
that more
helpful,
can I
though?
throw something
Yeah.
there real quick about the parking? So if
Yeah.
we force people to call 911, that does incur a cost for
no, I know.
us.
Right.
So there's a way to do it with,
Well, then let's,
with
but
online reporting.
yeah,
We
let's
could
do it
that
different way.
through the
That if
county.
that's going to code.
So that's something we can do. The online reporting is slower
Right.
than see-click fix.
Yeah,
It-
but
it's-
let's figure out
Just
another way.
because I'm a big see-click fix user,
Right.
I see a lot of times if somebody doesn't actually see the issue, it just goes under other. They're still probably gonna report it. If they want to report something,
call us.
they're going to report it. So I don't know that pulling it out is.
Okay.
But we'd
But-
love to.
But I think I was just telling Regan, I think what you're bringing up, Sean, what I'm kind of hearing you say is what we're seeing other cities kind of do of like, where do we want to put our energy, right? And if parking's kind of this like ongoing thing that's really not resulting in anything beneficial, what's the feedback loop we can provide on see-click fix, right? Like, so right now when you go to report parking, maybe the information we give people before they report
Yeah.
is more clear, right?
Right.
And then the output of what they can expect is more clear, right? I live in Seattle and they have it very clear, like, if you're complaining about your neighbor parking on their street, if it's not seen by a parking enforcement officer, we're not responding. Like, full stop.
How would the neighbor know though if it's seen by an enforcement officer?
would.
Well, they
It
wouldn't,
would.
they would just get a kick, they would
Yeah.
just,
That's the only way the ticket's gonna get.
that's the only way the
Basically,
ticket's gonna be written.
So
Okay.
what they're saying is we're not going to respond.
Yeah, if it.
Unless it's
Yeah.
a law enforcement
Yeah.
infraction.
Yes.
You have an amazing.
I appreciate this update, Brian. Thank you.
Yeah,
May
so we
feel like
we
you're
noodle
the
on
hot
that,
seat, but-
and we've been noodling on just doing that for all of our categories as well. Like, how can we better?
I think that's a
feedback.
good idea with the parking and we could add that educational piece and even remove the category.
Mhm.
They
then-
still, like Brian said, could report it under other and we could just see what that
What that
does for
does.
the next
Mhm.
6
We can
months or
test it,
something.
we can test it.
Yeah.
Yeah, I just.
On the, Sean brought up about the code changes. So looking at nuisance vehicles, I know we have, what is it, 8 they can
Mhm.
have on their property?
No. So a nuisance
on-
vehicle is different than the number of vehicles you can park on a property. So, yes, for parking, number of vehicles you can park on your property, you can park 6 or less if I think the property is 12,500 square feet or
Quarter of
less.
an acre.
If it's more, then you can go up to 8.
So is this something that you could bring back to us as a code change? I know that what we do for one property is going to affect the entire city,
Mhm.
right? But that one property is on the corner of a heavily traveled
Yeah.
intersection. So I don't know how we can do that without creating problems. But I know the two of you are very resourceful. So is Mark.
Yeah.
Because that's where we get a lot of
Yeah.
complaints about on that property.
So, I mean, I guess the question would be for me on that, you're right, Mayor, what you do for one, you do for all. And we can't really spot zone it,
Right.
but I guess the question I would have for the council, like, are you okay if people are allowed to park less cars on
so
their
did-
property?
That's the problem.
Yeah.
Didn't we change the code because of that property? And isn't that property the weird outlier as it's not actually coded or it's not a
Residential.
property, it's not residential?
It's MH or
It's MH.
R18.
Oh, it's R18. Yeah, it is residential.
We didn't change the code for that, I
I
don't
think we
believe.
clarified it back in the
Um,
day.
We clarified, but it was part of the inspiration.
But yeah, but then also kind of the last follow-up to that is, again, these are tier 3, low priority, which
Right.
even if we go down to 6, we really haven't taken those to the next level. So somebody like him, who's really living on the edge already,
Chronic.
unless
chronic
we're willing and
repeat.
council really
Mhm.
wants us to start doing the next step or
Notice the
next 2
violation.
steps of going to violation and charging somebody $100, $250, $500 a day for parking of vehicles or some of those other things, it probably doesn't,
Right.
going down to 6 and not having that support or that
How many
want.
times
So-
has he been cited?
Well, he hasn't been cited
Yeah.
ever.
So what my,
Report it. How many times has he been
Reported. He's had 2 code violations since he bought the property. He bought the property, I think, in 2019, and that's the first, 2018, 2019, that's the first time I talked to him. Which we had the violation, he complied, it complied for a while, and then all of a sudden there was one extra, then one extra, then one extra, then it was 13 or 14 again. And so we went back to the second code violation, and he actually got to a letter that we haven't really talked about too much, where we have already implemented something different, where it's more of a, you have 60 days, or we are going to start fining you. Last year, we created a new, we call it notice of violation letter. And at that point with him, he actually got
Complied.
down to the,
so my
Yeah.
concern is not just appearance.
Mhm.
It's on soil next to a creek
Mhm.
that could cause contamination
Mhm.
of the creek. So even though it's a distance from the creek, it still can seep through the aquifers and everything else with that many vehicles on
Grass.
that grass.
Non-permeated.
Supposedly it's gravel.
gravel underneath. He doesn't maintain it, so grass is
Yeah.
coming up, but
Yeah.
it's, we understood, completely understood.
Does council
But-
want something brought back for less
Best estimate.
vehicles? Is that what?
Well, the problem
No.
is that other properties.
Well, we can change, you can also change the calculation.
Well, I think
Yeah.
one of the things that we talked about.
There's a math game there.
I remember when Jenna and Ryan were working on this with the planning commission, one of the things they were talking about is that grass is actually more of a filter than some of the other substances. I'm not trying to admit, I totally dig what you're saying there, but like, if that's because I think the reason we did this was to help protect our groundwater, right? And as well as preventing people from parking
like
every story of their yard,
I
aesthetics.
wonder how many of those we actually have.
Is there another way that we can get? To be honest, if you built a fence and nobody could see it, we probably would not be hearing
Yeah.
about a thing about it
Well,
from anyone, but it's so blatant and out there. Everybody knows that it's going on. You can't not do it, if you know that it's going on.
Right, right.
And the fence we just put up 2 months ago.
Yeah,
No, it doesn't hide it.
I'm not, you guys
It
are.
adds
awesome.
So we got two,
So,
Mhm.
so,
So, okay, go ahead.
no, I was just gonna say, go ahead and finish.
Oh, no, I was gonna just repeat back what I'm hearing from the council. So we want to go back and we probably want to strengthen our chronic nuisance, like add some provisions, some
Yeah.
basic provisions that we've kind of walked you through, which is probably accumulation and duration and time period. And there's some standards in the industry about that, so we can present those. And then I think where we're still waiting, maybe some feedback is, do we want to look at that number of vehicles on property.
I feel like.
Or change the
residents
calculation,
Or change the,
Change the calculation. So
like
bring
less
something
allowed
back
for
to see
size.
what you can do to tweak.
okay, okay.
I mean, people were really upset when it
Well,
got
we did.
changed to begin.
And I
with.
Yeah.
have to have my 4, like I'm
Yeah.
Yeah.
skating with 2 drivers.
Yeah.
And, I mean,
It's a,
It's not gonna solve anything.
right,
By
So I don't
changing the
mind-
calculation.
I don't think it will.
Right.
no,
Right.
but it's the, how we deal with chronic.
correct.
Yeah.
And
So
I-
maybe
I-
that's what it is.
So
Or
It's up to the council.
Done, sorry. It's,
So no, so no on nuisance, yes on chronic. Okay. Is that the council consensus feedback?
What do you mean no on nuisance?
Like, we're not gonna touch the nuisance number.
Vehicle.
Number of
Vehicles,
cars.
sorry, that's what I meant.
The only thing I would say
Being-
is it's near a critical area.
Yeah.
Because
It's,
anyway,
it's
different.
out, yeah, it's
That's
outside of any
regulated
buffer area.
Right.
Yeah, it's 2.5 properties over from where the actual creek is, where Jenkins Creek goes through there. So understood, still can make its way over there. But
okay,
Okay.
So did we say
all right.
8
So-
for nuisance?
8 for larger properties, it's 6.
Over
for
1,200
smaller
square feet.
properties.
It's not nuisance, just 8 vehicles.
8 vehicles,
vehicles,
sorry.
a
That's
nuisance
my
vehicle
bad.
is what we
Nuisance is
call,
different.
or what most people call a junk vehicle. So the
Yeah.
vehicles, these in this case aren't
They're
because people
functioning,
move
they're
around,
registered.
we
Yeah.
can't, they don't meet
Yeah.
the definition of a nuisance vehicle, they're just a number of vehicles.
Okay.
So, thank you all very much.
Thank you.
The study session's over and we will
The
be
cat's
starting.
been hurt.